But you might bear in mind that the consequences of rational solutions are what we are dealing with at the present. Rationalism has been the dominant paradigm for problem solving for about 500 years, and it has led us deeper and deeper into, contradiction, resource mismanagement, dehumanization, misperception of each other, so forth and so on. That's why, in a way, I think that the art reflex is more important because, or more efficacious, because if we act from the point of view of wanting to create art, what we're really saying is that reality has outrun apprehension. We can no longer make rational sense out of reality, so the ego is set aside and the logos, or the muse, is invoked, and then we produce art. And the almost the distinguishing characteristic of great art is that it not be fully comprehensible to its creator. So we then act as agents of the logos when we create art. And the art that is created is then put out into the cultural environment of meaning, and is then subject to a kind of natural selection similar to the kind of natural selection that goes on in in an environment where biological species are competing. The shorthand way of saying this is the best idea will win, but it won't win unless it competes. You can't win the race unless you run the race. So rather than beating our brains against the end of history, trying to create rational solutions to what is essentially an irrational situation in the first place, it would be, I think, much better to become servants of the logos, servants of the Gaian mind, and then to let the chips fall where they may. Let the selective pressures of intellectual history sort out among the many options, and those that are important will come to the fore. Does that get it as a brief pass? Why it's important? It's important because it's anti-rational, because it's anti-ego, because it says we are vessels and agents of the solution, but we can't, it doesn't spring from our ability to integrate data and reflect it back. It's much more irrational than that. This sort of goes to what I thought I would talk about a little bit tonight. I used the phrase a few minutes ago, reality outruns apprehension. This is actually a phrase from Moby Dick, not the part of Moby Dick that I will probably end up reading to you tonight. But what I thought would be interesting to talk about, basically because of its intrinsic interest and its recent intensification, is sort of the question, what is reality, number one, and then what's so great about it? And
why bother?
Yeah, why bother? I mean, we really have a bee in our bonnet about reality. When you get out of touch with it, this is considered not a good thing. Reality is the unmoving reference point in a universe of flux to which we are always supposed to go back and re-reference ourselves. And it's a funny concept. First of all, it is a concept. It's not an object with its own interior ontos. In other words, it doesn't have being outside of the culture's assumptions about it. This is the first big news about reality. The reality of the Litoto is a completely different reality from the West European or the Canadian. And yet the reality is, we assume that there is a kind of bedrock, and we call that reality, then everything is referenced back toward that. Well, I wanted to talk about it tonight because it's an incredibly slippery concept. I mean, I would say getting your hands on reality is about as likely as getting your hands on true love. You know, you're always going toward it or looking back at it, but you rarely have it in front of you in the moment. And yet the moment is where we spend most of our time. So we're kind of run ragged by the nostalgia for something we never knew, is what it almost comes down to. So, first of all, whenever we want to talk about something seriously and profoundly, we have recourse to science. However, reality is a term that, if it's used at all, it's used in philosophy, in ontology, in epistemology. It is not a concept that you hear very often on the lips of scientists. Well, why is this? Well, it's because science, which is the enterprise which seeks to carry out a complete investigation of reality, has quickly satisfied itself that the beast can't be caged. It's very hard to actually come up with something concrete. And that's an interesting notion that any discussion of reality will tend to come back to. It wasn't until the 1930s that Alfred North Whitehead, in his book Process and Reality, created the great phrase that has now entered the language, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. You've all probably heard this phrase, or maybe you haven't heard this phrase. But anyway, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is the belief that there is something somewhere which is real, which can be depended upon, which everything else can be referenced back to. And as long as you are victim of this fallacy, you are philosophically naive and probably not at ease psychologically, because, you know, it's like, as I said, nostalgia for something you never knew. The way science's method, which worked very well for the first 450 years, and by science, I don't mean science going back to the Greeks. I mean science since the Renaissance. Mathematically based Cartesian materialism is basically my notion of science. Its method is what's called reductionism. This is the theory that if you want to understand something, an atom, a plant, a society, a geological formation, what you do is you take it apart, you deconstruct it, you dismantle it and catalog its parts, and then define their relationships to each other. And then somehow when you recombine all these maps of this deconstructed object, you then somehow possess it. And this worked very well up until well into the 20th century, because it was assumed that matter, which was taken to be somehow a primary constituent of reality, that matter was made out of tiny billiard balls that were called Hamiltonian atoms, and that these distinct and concrete billiard balls could be located absolutely in time and space, and their relationships to each other defined as charge, force, momentum, spin, so forth and so on, and that out of these primary qualities, adhering to these elementary particles, notice these words primary, elementary, that are telling us we're getting close to bedrock, out of this, you could reconstruct the world. The problem is, and I won't bore you with this because so many people have, quantum physics showed that these hard little billiard balls were the most tragic example of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. They don't exist. There isn't such a thing. When you go down and down and down, suddenly everything becomes paradoxical. Ordinary logic no longer applies. And without beating a dead horse, I would remind you that quantum physics, quantum electrodynamics, which is always held up as the greatest intellectual edifice ever constructed by the mind of man, is a complete myth in terms of the aesthetic of its logics, because it requires two logics operating simultaneously. You have what is called ordinary logic, the logic that we as animals intuitively gravitate toward, logic which says things such as, if it is A, then it is not B, if it is now, then it is not then, if it is after, then it is not before. This is kind of logic that assumes concrete objects in a linear time stream. But quantum physics then, to solve the problems it sets itself, it requires another kind of logic, an extremely exotic logic called Boolean algebra. And so what you get when you look at a quantum mechanical explanation of nature is you get what are called aisles of Boole embedded in ordinary mathematical logic. So there are actually transition zones, very distinct transition zones, where you simply switch logics in midstream, literally in midstream, in order to solve the problem. Well, this then gives you a nice a set of numbers in an experimental situation where you're trying to calculate the charge of the electron or the displacement value of particles or something like that. But it rests on this completely inelegant switching back and forth from one logic to another as the case requires, which means the human observer is brought in and you get to decide which logic to use, and then you can use one for a few minutes and then switch back to the other and go back and forth. And upon such shifting sand as this, the entire edifice of science rests. Okay, well that's really all I want to say about the scientific view of reality. It's just to, Paul.
Kind of. I don't see science that way, and I think many want us to distinguish science and physics because in the 19th century there were many physicists who realized and argued against the possibility of a mechanistic universe. And quantum mechanics was final death call of that point of view, but it was argued for 100 years, maybe 300 years before that. The mechanism can't exist. The reality doesn't exist.
You mean, are you thinking of vitalism?
No, I'm just thinking that it was clear to many physicists, at least in the last century, that we weren't going to be, in other words, this notion of atoms was very clearly understood to be just a model. People, at least the self-physicists, didn't confuse the notion of a model or a concept with reality. And in fact, I'd be quite clearly with these concepts out of reality. In fact, we'll never find a mechanism for our...
Yeah, well, the great enlightenment of 19th century physics occurred around the issue of fields, because until James Clerk Maxwell and Lorentz and these people wrote the equations for the electromagnetic field, it was denied that such a thing was possible because it had this quality, this apparent quality of action at a distance. And that completely freaked out 19th century expectations of how nature should behave. We take this completely for granted. I mean, there's a radio sitting in this cabinet that we could flip on, and if we weren't in such a benighted geographical situation, we could hear hundreds of AM and FM radio stations. Well, those are wave mechanical systems that are filling this room, that are invisible to ordinary perception. To the 19th century mind, this was completely occult and astonishing. We take it for granted. Marshall McLuhan at one point suggested that the worldwide electrification of the planet through the spread of radio and television and electrical systems was actually the descent of the Holy Ghost into history, that electricity was the Holy Ghost to control and to understand, because we can do it. We don't need the second coming of Christ. We don't need divine intervention to destroy this planet. We can do it well enough on our own, thank you. So a huge responsibility evolves upon people within the global culture to try and come to terms with what is possible and what is to be done. And I think we have to doubt everything that we're told. All the ideology that we have inherited served a different kind of world. I mean, don't forget that as recently as 100 years ago, people believed that the Earth was created on September 15th, 4004 BC. I mean, the steam engine was the most powerful form of technology that existed. In the last 100 years, we have gone more than half of the distance that we've traveled in the last 50,000 years. And you can actually begin to see the outlines of what it's all about. As caretakers of the earth, as caretakers of intelligence, because this is all the intelligence that we know of, we must, in fact, come to terms with what is being asked of us. What is it that we are supposed to be doing? How can we rationally order our societies to maximize the values that we inherently and intrinsically feel to be worth saving? I mean, why did we fall into history?
Creating culture. What were we afraid of?
What were we afraid of?
Afraid of. I've been reading Camille Paglia, and she says it's just that
We go to Rastro.
well, you know what
Oh, I know what she says, yeah.
the big chaos, the underworld, that quality is a violence of nature. The history.
Well, I think what happened, and you know, you've all heard me talk about it in operational terms, that we were as embedded in nature as the fox and the leafcutter ant and the polar bear until 100,000 years ago, or something like that. And then this ability to signify, it has something to do with our relationship to shamanism and psychedelic drugs. You see, when you look at primates of all types, going clear back to squirrel monkeys, you always get male dominance. Male dominance was not invented in the Middle East 3,000 years ago. Squirrel monkeys have alpha male primates, and anthropoid apes. All of the primates have this problem. But I really believe that we temporarily overcame it. About from, let's say, 25,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, we temporarily overcame the tendency for male dominance to occur as a natural part of our being social animals. And this happened because shamanism evolved as an institution which relied on psychoactive plants to dissolve the male ego. And it's not only, I mean, we don't have to call it the male ego. That just polarizes and genderizes the thing. It's the ego. The ego is this strange transference of loyalty from the group to the self, the individual body. And then we call that the self. The reason this, so that psychedelic shamanism, specifically the use of psilocybin on the plains of Africa, was like a chemical inoculation against the formation of ego. And under the influence of psychedelic compounds, we evolved language and social roles and rudimentary agriculture, nomadism, all of these things. But then the psychedelic substances which made this possible began to become less and less available. This is simply because of climatic change in Africa. You see, the Sahara, what is now the Sahara Desert, was a veldt of grassland throughout prehistory, as late as Roman times. The Roman historian Pliny referred to North Africa as the breadbasket of Rome. It means that climatologically it was entirely different. And in that African theater, we emerged out of animal organization and into a world of language, cognition, ritual, ceremony, so forth and so on. And it was a style of psychedelic shamanism complexed with an orgiastic religious style. Now, the reason this is important, this orgiastic style, is because it makes it impossible to trace lines of male paternity. Women know who their children are because they see their children come out of their bodies. But men couldn't know that. And so all values were group values. The tribe was as identified with true being as we now identify our ego. So people were altruistic, not in any holier than thou or pietistic way. It's just simply how they were, in the same way that the members of an anthill are altruistic. I mean, ants don't flee from a problem because they're trying to save their own necks. They hurl themselves at the problem until it is solved, because conservation of the group values is the most important thing. Well, when...
Wait, so why instead of being a male society, why then couldn't this be passed on by the female? I mean, the female knows who her offspring is. Why?
But the female has built into her physiology a boundary-dissolving experience in the form of the birth experience. And in these African tribal societies, it didn't happen once or twice in a woman's life. It happened a dozen or 20 times. So women, by virtue of giving birth, and by virtue of this experience of seeing another person come out of their body, can never get so firmly embedded this notion of their inviolate and unique self. So it's just biologically scripted into femaleness that several times in your life you're going to be melted down into this situation, and it's a very deep imprinting. In the absence of psychedelic plants or drugs, a male can go from birth to the grave and never have this experience. And millions of people do that. And millions of people go from the birth to the grave without ever discovering the relativistic nature of the ego. They entirely identify it with the self, when in fact it isn't that at all. Now the mystery in all of this is the fact that it's kind of reductionist to say that taking these psychedelic plants dissolves the ego, because there has to be something then which rushes into this now empty space. where the ego previously held sway. What rushes in to that liberated space is what I call the Gaian mind, that there is actually a hyper-intelligent being on this planet, or in this planet. It perhaps is this planet, but it is sentient. It thinks, it can communicate. We are like atoms inside the body, or cells inside the body of this enormous organism, which is the cause of our religious obsessing. The reason we're always running around looking for God Almighty is because we evolved on a planet inhabited by a super intelligence that we have lost contact with. And so we deny its intelligence. We, at this point, even deny its vitality. I mean, you know, the Judeo-Christian shtick is that nature is to be at the service of man. And, you know, this is a complete inversion of the idea that human beings should be the active hands of the Gaian mind. And this didn't happen for any, there's no bad guy in this scenario. It's simply that the climatological conditions which allowed this social mode that was characterized by nomadic pastoralism, orgy, and psychedelic shamanism was gradually replaced by, because of drying of the African continent, these psychedelic substances were no longer available. And there was even an intermediate phase where the psychedelic substance, if it was the mushroom, was preserved in honey, so that the great festivals became further and further apart in time, and the ego enters then like a tumor. It begins to form in the personalities of human beings. If you're engaging in psychedelic intoxication and orgy at every full moon, there is no chance for the ego to get a hold. I mean, it's just an aberration that everybody jumps on and is gotten rid of. But if these ceremonies become yearly or less frequent, then these funny notions get going in the more powerful males. Why shouldn't I control more females? Why shouldn't I have more of the food supply? Why shouldn't this area, in fact, be for me to hunt in alone? You get all these concepts of mindness that arise out of the growth of this tumorous, cancerous, maladaptive self-defining, because that it doesn't serve. And we have committed ourselves to this thing so whole hog for the past 5,000-10,000 years that now we're so deep into it that it's not clear we can ever extricate ourselves from it, except, and this is the raison d'etre for my career, is we have to go back to the archaic solution, which is, and it can't be orgy. That can't be the archaic solution that we implement, because we're not a nomadic tribe of pastoralists, only 70 or 80 human beings. We're a global culture of 5 billion people. If we tried to resuscitate lunar orgies, we'd have a wave of social and sexually transmitted diseases that would probably finish us once and for all. So the orgy thing is not the answer, but the psychedelic option still exists. It still dissolves the ego, and it still puts you in contact with viable group values. So this is perhaps an answer. And I don't advocate it because I think it's a sure thing. I advocate it because I think it's the only game in town. Hell, if hortatory beating on people could have worked, then we would have solved all our problems thousands of years ago, because Buddha and Christ and all these other people, they had the right idea. It's just that ideas don't cut the mustard. It has to be an experience, a real experience. And a boundary-dissolving experience is so corrosive to all the institutions of dominator society that no religion in the West, since has been able to come to terms with the psychedelic experience because it mitigates male dominance, hierarchy, and all the other things that are the methods by which we do business.
Why do we think that if we have it, that there would be this window of opportunity to develop an ego to begin with? What, you know?
Well, it was that we had a chemically mediated symbiosis with the Gaian mind, and it was it wasn't a locked symbiosis like you get in lichens or something like that. It was a kind of flirtation with symbiosis. It was that we took these psychedelic plants and contacted this hyperdimensional mind of nature and discovered that because it was hyperdimensional, because it wasn't constrained in space and time the way we are, that it had useful information, very practical information. Where has the game gone? This is what shamans are good for, is to tell you where the game has gone. How will the weather be next year? Classical problem for shamans. Well, how do they know this stuff? So you see, shamanism is essentially a going into a higher dimension to obtain information that then feeds back into the group destiny. Well, how can we shamans know this stuff? How can they attain to this superhuman level of understanding? It's that they get in touch with a different kind of intelligence, an intelligence to whom where the game will be next year is as transparent as where the game was last year, because past and future don't exist for that intelligence. And our relationship to that intelligence was one of devotee to goddess or supplicant to mystery. But eventually the connection was broken, and meanwhile the ego was arising, and the ego is like a mirroring of this larger psychic function. In other words, the ego is our pathetic attempt to create God on our own. This was Julian Jaynes' theory. He thought, you see, that up until as late as Homeric times, which is 800 BC, that if you got into a tight spot and were about to be offed or something, miraculously a voice would appear, would come on. It would just turn on in your head, and it would say, "You should get out of there." And people thought this was a god. It was a god. But eventually they were able to assimilate this psychic function into the personality. And then they said, well, that's not God talking. That's me. That's myself. And this is the idea where God is then located inside my body. And I take orders from this inner God that I call the ego. And if it is allowed to develop, and it's strange, it always develops along these patriarchal lines, you know. It brooks no babbling. It's not interested in argument. It knows what is to be done. And then the only time you get a problem is when you place one ego in contact with another. And then, of course, they go at it hammer and tongs. But originally what we had was a symbiotic relationship with this Gaian mind. And this is the mystery that haunts this planet, haunts our history, haunts our psychedelic experiences and our dreams. It's that there really is a controlling super intelligence that can be contacted through psychedelic drugs, presumably religious practice, practice when you see how long they've been making the claim, although it must be a high noise signal when you do it that way, because they seem to get it always skewed off in some weird direction that then reinforces paternalistic institutions. But this is what all this goddess talk is about, is either we are becoming more sensitive to the presence of the Gaian mind, or the Gaian mind, under pressure of the approaching apocalyptic crisis, is beginning to raise its voice louder and louder and louder. So that now, when you go into nature loaded, every rock, every tree, every stream is saying, awaken, awaken, come to focus. There's minutes to go, as William Burroughs likes to say, So we have to connect up. And so we are, in a sense, the hands of this diffuse supermind that is spread through nature. And our presence as thinking, reflecting, culture-building individuals is not simply an amazing but meaningless set of circumstances. Our presence as a global technical civilization signifies the onset of the final crisis. It's as though, you watch a pond and the surface is smooth, mirror smooth. Well, then the surface of the pond begins to churn. This is the signal that something huge is about to emerge out of the pond. And human history is that turbulence on the still surface of nature. Nature would never have allowed a phenomenon like human history to get going were it not in response to a deeply felt planetary crisis that is approaching at ever-accelerating speed. And I have enough faith in nature to believe that when the moment finally is upon us, we'll be ready. But the tools are being laid up right now. The ultimate tools, not the prototype tools. The bow and arrow, that was a prototype. The catapult, that was a prototype. The B-17, that was a prototype. But thermonuclear tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, this is not the prototype. This is the actual instrument by which you could save a planet as well as destroy it, because you're at last dealing on the level of energies necessary to make those kinds of changes. And I think the evidence is all around us that the historical mode cannot persist. It can't. Just draw all the curves. Output of petroleum distillates, output of energy, population growth, proliferation of weapons. When you draw all of these curves, they can't be propagated 500 years into the future. Sometime in the next 50 years, we're going to have to make or break what history was all about. And the arising of global culture, the arising of an integrated electronic awareness, high-speed computational machinery, tremendously powerful weapons, spacecraft, all of this stuff looks to me like the raw material for a salvational exercise. And notice that it's not only a way to save the planet, it's in a sense a way to save not only ourselves, but to save our ancestors as well. This, if we can act in a moment of great crisis to preserve the planet from ruination, we will redeem human history. Then it all makes sense. The pogroms, the migrations, the brutality, the stupidity, it was all toward a purpose. And then somehow those lives that were lost in those pogroms and invasions and migrations and so forth are given meaning. a meaning which they will totally not have if we simply blow the planet apart and wreck nature and ruin the oceans and blow off the atmosphere. Then it just looks like a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury that signifies nothing. So it's as though the meaning itself is in our hands. What shall we make of this? Is it just, as James Joyce said, atoms and ifs? Or is there a plan, a process, a plot, and a role for us that will give us some dignity in this situation, which otherwise, up to this point, as far as I can see, we totally lack. I mean, it's all very well to spend an afternoon wandering around the Louvre, but on the other hand, spend the next day wandering around the slums of Calcutta, and you just really have to wonder about what the human enterprise is about. Now I will read you this little quote from Moby Dick, which sort of gets to some of this. Are you all familiar with Moby Dick? Are any of you familiar with Moby Dick? You should be. I mean, this is the greatest work of prose ever written by an American without contest, I think. I mean, I like to think that when human history is written, Americans will be remembered for two things. They went to the moon, and they're the people who produced Moby Dick. I mean, this is our Odyssey. This is our Odyssey and our Iliad. Nobody's ever gone past it. Okay, there's a scene early on. You all know that it's a whale hunt, right? Okay, so there is a scene where the captain, who is running this show and driving this hunt for this whale to a truly apocalyptic conclusion, because for him this is no hunt for an animal, this is a confrontation with an alien god, and he is determined to murder this thing because it, as he delicately puts it, dismasted him, meaning it bit off his leg and destroyed his sexual machinery. And his first mate, who functions as Christian right reason, wimpy little Starbuck, says, "Vengeance on a dumb brute," cried Starbuck, "that simply smote thee from blindest instinct? Madness. To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, seems blasphemy." And Ahab says, "Hark ye yet again the little lower layer. All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks. But in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there is naught beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinnowing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. And be the white whale agent, or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy. I would strike out the sun if it insulted me. For could it do that, then could I do the other, since there is ever a sort of fair play." And that was the point I wanted to make, about 2 points: striking through the mask to achieve reality, and that we can do it, because there is ever a sort of fair play. The field is level. The cards are not stacked against us. If we play our hand right, we can take the whole game. They wouldn't have it any other way. That's right. By the way, I'm getting into that book by Camille Paglia called Sexual Persona, and it's definitely the read of the season. and I didn't realize the publication date is listed as September 1991, so it's hot. And I read the section on Moby Dick, which comes very close to the end, and if all of it's as good as that, then it's really something. I mean, there hasn't been that much fun between the covers of one book since Marshall McLuhan wrote The Gutenberg Galaxy. So, if you think of yourself as a feminist, an art historian, a literary critic, an egghead, all these things, she's just outrageous. I think we have to get her here as fast as possible, because she's really freewheeling and makes a lot of people mad, which is always a good sign, I think. It's called Sexual Persona by Camille Paglia. Maybe some of you saw about a month ago in the Image magazine, which is the insert in the Sunday, there was an article about her and they put her on the cover, and she's very controversial and says lots of provocative things, and the article stressed her dumping on Derrida and Lacan and Foucault and that whole crowd, and saying, all of them put together were not worth one page of William Burroughs, basically. And, not that we care about this, but in academia, this is big news because they're in awe of all those people. I tried to read Derrida. I couldn't make head nor tails of it. It just seemed to me like anti-thought. All of this is inspired by a number of papers that have recently been called to my attention. I can get this the way I want it. And one of them is called, and I recommend it to your attention, it appeared in the June 1989 issue of Zygon, and it's called The Omega Point as Eschaton, Answers to Pannenberg's Questions for Scientists. And this is, it's by Frank Tipler, and this is a very interesting article which tries to argue for the reality of Christian eschatological hermeneutics in the light of information theory, and actually makes a number of points that I thought I would be alone in making for my entire life, and now I see that I'm actually an infant in this department, and that these people have thought more deeply and more widely and with a more stunning commitment to radical ideas than I could have even conceived of. I mean, it's humbling stuff. I mean, they're talking here about computer strategies to resurrect the dead, not some of the dead, all of the dead, and a number of ideas that I confess were completely alien and exciting to me. And I also have a correspondence between Frank Tipler and Hans Moravec, the author of this little thing I just read you, and a paper by Moravec that apparently has not yet been published called Time Travel and Computing. And time travel is sort of what I wanted to talk about this evening from a certain peculiar perspective. One of the ideas that I've had to embed in my system fairly uncomfortably, because I think of myself basically as a skeptic and a rationalist, is the idea that the world is on the brink of a tremendous transformation, a transformation on a scale such that it can really only be compared to the events which created the universe in the first place. This is what ties this series of notions to Christian eschatology, because the unique preoccupation expectation of Western religion, whether it be Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, is this weird insistence on the end of the world, the collapse of reality as we know it. You don't get this in Eastern thinking. As you all probably know, Hinduism is a theory of what is essentially a steady state. There are cycles of outpouring of phenomena and then regressive cycles when everything recondenses. But the universe is basically thought to be eternal. And this then poses no problem for rational expectation, because it's very easy to imagine an eternal universe. In Christianity, to preserve the rationality of expectation, the eschatological event, I guess I should explain that term. All these ESCH words, eschaton, eschatological, so forth and so on, mean we're referencing the final things. The branch of theology that is called eschatology is the study of the final things, the end of the world. And the way Christianity has handled it to preserve rationality, at least superficially, is by setting it far, far in the future. Then it doesn't irritate or, demand a great deal of thought and consideration. My notion has, against my own intellectual gravity, has pushed me toward the conclusion that it is near, which puts me in the same category as all those people in cartoons carrying signs which say, repent for the end is near. And it's the thing, I feel, shy. I don't know if I have the decency to feel shy, but I feel always reluctant to talk about it because it is the most counterintuitive position in the system that I've tried to elaborate. Because not only do I think it's near, but I think that we can say when it is. And just so you aren't kept hanging in suspense.
Tomorrow at 8:30.
Close. December 22nd, 2012, at dawn, Eastern Standard Time, the universe will roll up like one of those blinds, It will just roll up. The stars will fall from heaven. Reality as we know it will completely disappear to be replaced by something else. Now, why would anyone think such a thing? What set of rational premises could lead to such an irrational notion? I have this idea that there is a counter-entropic principle built into the universe that has not been described by science at all. It may have been noticed, but never in its inclusive nature. And I call this anti-entropic principle novelty. Novelty it has been increasing since the very first moments of the birth of the universe. Whether you subscribe to the orthodox cosmology of a Big Bang, which I would like to sit on the fence about, it seems to me, you may think my notion is unlikely, but you should remind yourself that what science believes is that the universe sprang from nothing in a single instant from an area whose diameter was less than that of the electron. It seems to me this is almost like the limiting case for the incredible. If you could believe that, what would you resist believing? I mean, if you believe that, you may be interested in a large bridge over the Hudson River that my family has had for generations and that we're willing to sell you for $1. But this is what science believes. This is what most scientists believe, although in all fairness, in the last 5 years, this has gotten more shaky. Not everybody now believes in the Big Bang. Well, what I would like to substitute for the Big Bang is what I call the big surprise. And the big surprise, it doesn't come at the beginning of the universe. It comes at the end of the universe. Which seems to me, you know, if you want to, the battle of the singularities, orthodox science says the entire universe sprang from a tiny area in a single instant. The notion that it sprang from pure nothingness. It sprang from a point-like dimension that was, so far as we can tell, utterly without any quality whatsoever. This seems to me the least likely environment in which to seek a singularity. I mean, how can we imagine, unless we call upon God Almighty, a perturbation in a flawless nothingness that would usher into, 10^47 particles of many types streaming outward, symmetry breaks, so forth and so on. It seems to me that all cosmological myths require a singularity of some sort, but some singularities are more likely than others. And so in my notion, and I call it my notion because so many people have told me I'm completely welcome to it. In my notion, the place to look for a singularity is in the most complicated circumstances imaginable, not an unflawed emptiness, but a world where you have atomic chemistry, polymer chemistry, organic chemistry, advanced animals and plants, languages, cultures, technologies, information coding and regurgitation systems. In other words, the more complexity that you can pile into a situation, the more likely you're going to get what is called an emergent property, or a singularity, or the big surprise. And so, as I look back at the history of the universe, over any scale you care to name, the last 5 years, the last 500 years, the last 500 million years, the last 5 billion years, there is a generality which seems to hold, which is complexity once come into existence is retained and folded back into the interstices of being to produce yet more complexity. This is linked, and at least appears linked, to the cooling of the universe. At the Big Bang, the temperature of the universe was trillions of degrees, and there was there wasn't even atomic chemistry. There was just a plasma of electrons. And then after some time, measured in nanoseconds, the temperature of the universe fell sufficiently so that stable orbits could be established around atomic nuclei, and then you have the emergence of simple inorganic chemistry. Well, then after a further fall in temperature and a much longer period of time, you get the thermal disruption of chemical bonds falls below the limit where you can get complex molecular structures, and then a whole new set of emergent properties, building on the levels which preceded until finally you get the birth of stars, and that is basically huge lumps of condensed hydrogen, the simplest of all elements. The hydrogen aggregates into stars in such amounts that tremendous pressures are set up at the center of these hydrogen masses, sufficient pressures for fusion to begin to take place, and fusion cooks out iron and other heavy elements, including carbon, and carbon then becomes the key to the next level of emergent complexity, and from there to us it's only a series of these declensions. But what's interesting about these declensions into complexity is that each phase happens more quickly than the phase that preceded it, so that and we actually are not peripheral to this process. We're at the center of this mandala by several different ways of thinking about it. The most convincing, I suppose, is that the density of connections in the human cerebral cortex makes the human cerebral cortex, without contest, the most densely ramified material in the universe. We carry within ourselves, then, the most complex organization that has been laid on to the material universe. And it seems to me this is a strong argument that we are at the cutting edge of this process of emergent novelty. Now, up until 1 million years or so ago, we were just one more animal wandering around on this planet, albeit a sort of weird animal. Bipedalism, binocular vision, complex pack signaling. But on the other hand, wolves and dogs and ants have complex pack signaling. But then we began to elaborate. Notice that up to that point, the most sophisticated information storage system that novelty had evolved was genetic storage in long polymerized molecules that templated other molecules to reproduce themselves. Well, with the emergence of human language, you get what is called epigenetic storage and conveyance of information in poetry, dance, ritual of all sorts, artistic endeavors of all sorts. This is the unique domain of human beings, and it represents a vast acceleration in the rate at which this kind of informational business can be transduced. Well, then, so it flows forward, and then about 12,000 years ago, we really get going by building cities, beginning to notch wood with our observations of lunar cycles and stuff like that, and then you know the rest of the story. I mean, it's just a jump from, as I said the other night, chipping flint off a core to hurling an instrument outside the solar system so that it can look back at our planetary system. An elf told me that, now there's a fine thing for a scientist to say. An elf told me that time travel is possible, but it is constrained in ways which are not normally part of our expectation of time travel. The way in which it's constrained is, once time travel is discovered, you can travel as far into the future as you wish, but you can't travel into the past any further than the moment of the invention of the first time machine. The reason for this is that before the invention of the first time machine, there were no time machines, and how can you take a time machine into a domain where there aren't any? You see, it's just to preserve logical consistency.
Mostly you can't drive a car where there hasn't been a car driven before.
That's right, you can't take a car where there are no roads. When cars were first invented, the main objection to them was, what are you going to do with this thing? You know, there's nowhere to, it can't go where a horse can go, so what good is it? So here's a fantasy scenario, which for a while I liked very much. It's that quantum physics and nanotechnology and all this malarkey is refined and focused toward the notion of building a time machine, so that then on the morning of December 22nd, 2012, at the World Time Institute in the Amazon, the first time journey is about to be taken, and the whole world is watching on holographic television as the Lady Temponaut is strapped into the machinery that will hurl her centuries into the future. And there's a countdown, and a button is pushed, and off she goes. Now, most people's interest would be to follow this woman wherever she's going, but let's forget her for a moment. The point has been made. She disappears. We assume she went off into the future. But what happens right there, right then? It seems to me in the very next millisecond, thousands of time machines would begin arriving from the future simply because they had driven to the end of the road. They had come back in time to witness the first journey into the future. It's as though you could take your Piper Cub and fly it to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1906 to see the Wright Flyer take off. You see? Are you all with me so far? Oh yeah, right. Now, there's a problem with this, which some of you I'm sure are thinking, I hope anyway, which is what's called the grandfather paradox, which is the old conundrum that haunts all time travel schemes, which is, if time travel were possible, you could go back in time and kill your own grandfather. Well, then you wouldn't exist. Well, so then this sets up a logical impossibility. Either you exist or you don't exist. And some science fiction authors have assumed that somehow massive influxes of synchronicity would preserve your grandfather. You know, you would approach him with your Saturday night special, but it would blow up in your hand, or it would ricochet off the St. Christopher medal he always wore, or something like that, because he cannot be killed by you, because in that case you wouldn't exist, in which case he couldn't be killed by you. And this troubled me for a long time then. What exactly would happen in this situation if a time, because the according to Hans Moravec of the Robotics Institute of Carnegie Mellon University, I mean, time travel is no big deal. The first paragraphs of this paper, the last few years have been good for time machines. Kip Thorne's renowned general relativity group at Caltech invented a new quantum gravitational approach to building a time gate, and an international collaboration gave a convincing rebuttal of the grandfather paradox arguments. Another respected group suggested time machines that exploit quantum mechanical time uncertainty. The technical requirements for these suggestions exceed our present capabilities, but each new approach seems less onerous than the last. There is hope yet that time travel will eventually become possible, even cheap. So I then saw another possibility, and this is the way we can fulfill the expectation of Christian hermeneutics, but not require the second coming of Christ or the intercession of God Almighty into history or all these other extreme unlikelihoods. And to understand it, we have to have recourse to a physical model in a very simple realm of chemistry and physics, which is the Bernoulli gas laws. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these, and they're very intuitive and easy to understand. We have a cylinder, and it contains a vacuum, and at one end of the cylinder we have a valve, and the valve is connected to a line which is connected to a tank of some inert gas, say nitrogen. So we open the valve to let the nitrogen rush into the cylinder that previously was a vacuum. Now, what happens inside that cylinder, I think, is intuitively obvious to all of us. The pressure equalizes over all points equally. In other words, you can't have 50 pounds of pressure at one end of the cylinder and 5 pounds of pressure at the other. We understand that in a gas, pressure distributes itself evenly in order to achieve equilibrium. Okay, hold that notion in your mind. Now think of our world in the late 1990s as a sphere or a cylinder of that sort, and think of cultures as gases at various pressures. And let's assign low pressures to the bare-assed folks in the Amazon and eastern Indonesia, and let's assign high pressures to the folks in Manhattan and at Caltech and Cambridge and Los Angeles and London. Well, then we can predict correctly, in fact, what is happening sociologically on this planet. What is happening is that the high-tech cultures are totally overwhelming the traditional cultures. The values of Manhattan and Los Angeles are flooding everywhere, and in spite of the tiny lip service we give to shamanism and body painting, the truth of the matter is Amazon cultures are not really making a major contribution at this point to the evolution of high-tech, global, information-dense electronic culture. Okay, that's the second level of this Bernoulli metaphor. So now let's go back to the situation where we send the Lady Temponaut off into the future. I'm not familiar with how they overcame the grandfather paradox, so we'll pretend that the grandfather paradox is very strong.
I want to say something to the grave.
Okay, I'm close to question time. Let me press forward relentlessly here, because the coffee's running out. I can feel it. The equilibrium density is dropping. Okay, so we send the Lady Temponaut off into the future, but now, with what we know about the equalization of high cultures versus low in a temporal medium, what happens from our point of view is that the rest of the history of the universe happens instantly. That even if it's billions of years of human culture and downloading into machines and claiming star system after star system and so forth and so on, somehow the state vector of all of those event systems collapses. I call this the God whistle principle. It's that we can actually call God into history. We can summon the end state of human evolution to appear a millisecond after we successfully achieve the implementation of this technology of time travel, in order to avoid all the paradoxes that would prevail if there was any extension to the post-time travel era beyond the moment of its inception. So this is a way of, in a sense, forcing the evolution of the universe, and it creates the phase transition of the eschaton, and is, to my mind, a practical, it creates the basin of attraction within the domain of our own lives. Now, is there any kind of precedent for something like this, even metaphorically in our own experience? Well, it turns out, yes, there is, in a kind of bizarre anecdote which should sober us considerably as we think about these things. When the first atomic weapon was built by the Manhattan Project in the desert of New Mexico, Fermi and Oppenheimer and all these people got together the night before the test at Trinity. And Fermi had a pad like this on which he had scrawled some equations, and he had reached the conclusion in the week before that they were not sure how high the temperature would go when they triggered this device, and Fermi had some back-of-the-envelope calculations which caused him to believe that the nitrogen in the atmosphere of the planet would begin to burn if they tested this thing, and that they would in effect ignite the atmosphere of the planet, and the fireball would spread around the entire planet and destroy everything. And they spent half the night going over these things, and they finally decided that the information necessary to make the decision was not available, and so they said, well, hell, throw the switch. You know, at least it'll get to show those Japs and Germans that we mean business. So, and then of course the test was carried out. The nitrogen did not burn, and instead we were ushered into the glorious era of weapons of mass destruction. So let me see, I've got some notes here. I think I covered everything. What's interesting about this is that for the first time in this article by Frank Tipler called The Omega Point as Eschaton, he seems, and this is why Paul is here, and I couldn't really get into it because it's crazy to repeat what you can't understand, but by an analysis and interpretation of quantum mechanics, Tipler reaches the conclusion that there is an omega point, and that it does represent the funneling together of all the what are called world lines, and he, for purposes of mental comfort, sets it far in the future. But in principle, there is no reason to do that. 12 or 13 years ago, the Swedish cosmologist Hans Altman wrote a wonderful little book called Worlds and Anti-Worlds, in which he made the suggestion that the entire universe is what's called a vacuum fluctuation, ex nihilo, literally out of nothingness. However, there's a caveat, which is this creation ex nihilo can only occur if what's called parity is conserved. Now, what this means is that these particles which come into being out of nothingness must come into existence paired with their antiparticle. And so it comes into being, let's say, an electron and an anti-electron, and they divide on separate trajectories, and then they reconnect and collide with each other and parity is conserved. In other words, nothing really happened. No laws of physics were violated because they annihilated each other. Now, for a long time, a while, this was thought to be entirely a kind of a theoretical construct. But then it was noticed that the theoretical models of black holes, which we referred to a few days ago, seem to imply that no radiation could leave a black hole, and yet certain kinds of black holes were observed to be giving off hard radiation in the form of X-rays. And it was realized that what was happening was vacuum fluctuations were taking place in the vicinity of the black hole, and because one particle went one way and one the other, the black hole interfered with the conservation of parity, and one of the particles was being sucked into the black hole, and the other particle was flying off into the ordinary universe and being seen by astronomers as hard radiation. So the fact that this process goes on has now been confirmed. Well, now an interesting thing about these vacuum fluctuations is that quantum physics places no upper limit on the size of a vacuum fluctuation. What it says is that the smaller the vacuum fluctuation, the fewer particles that are involved, the more likely the vacuum fluctuation is. And obviously, from observing black holes, we can see that very small vacuum fluctuations occur quite frequently. Well, Alf then took all this and said, well then, is it not possible that the entire universe, our entire universe, is simply a very large vacuum fluctuation, a vacuum fluctuation involving something like 10 high 50 particles, and they have poured into the manifold in which we find ourselves, and an antimatter universe, invisible to us because it's in another dimension, was born at the same time. And so one universe went off into a higher dimensional manifold this way, and another one went off in the other direction. And what this sets us up for is the possibility allowed by this interpretation of quantum physics that the entire universe could disappear instantly. Not gradually. You wouldn't see the stars going out, but because this is all happening in a hyperspace of some sort, which treats this manifold as a point-like entity. So what you would have is just click, and all particles in the universe would disappear, and the original unflawed nothingness would be restored. Actually, no. There's a further caveat to all this, which is all particles have their antimatter, antiparticle twin, except the photon. The photon is this mysterious particle which is different from all other particles. It either has no antiparticle, or somehow it has its own antiparticle embedded within it. So what would happen in the case of a universe which was a vacuum fluctuation, which encountered its ghost image and conserved parity and canceled all particles except photons, is that you would suddenly have a universe made of nothing but light. Nothing but light. And we then have to model the physics of a universe where the only kinds of particles that exist are light. Well, it's interesting that all these human traditions of transcendentalism make a big deal about light. I mean, light is the metaphor for spirit. And the supposition is that the rarefaction of matter and of the flesh releases us into a realm of light. And I am not physicist enough by a long shot to say what the behavior of a universe made of light would be, but I do know enough to say that if you or I were made of light, our subjective experience of the universe would be ruled by relativistic physics, and we would have the impression that we could go anywhere instantly, and we would have the impression that the universe was aging around us at a tremendous rate, because you see, the time dilation of the general theory of relativity says that as you approach the speed of light, time slows down. Now, it's assumed that you can't reach the speed of light, because as you approach the speed of light, your mass asymptotically increases, so that to push a single atom to the speed of light would require more energy than there is in the entire universe, because this particle would have become so massive that there isn't enough energy to propel it. But a photon never moves slower than the speed of light. It never moves faster than the speed of light either. So the photon, if you were made of photons and you went from here to Zenebel-Ganubi, let's say, a star in our galaxy with a wonderful name, your impression of the travel time would be zero. You wouldn't, and so, again, here is a way, without invoking God Almighty, where physics seems to lay into our hands metaphors for the anticipation of the eschaton. Paul, do you want to say something at this point?
Fascinating. In your favor with physics. Everything has to be conserved. No, it's not just parity. In the vacuum fluctuation, I mean, charge, matter, antimatter, charge, the whole pair is just one of the conservation, one of the dozen. Conservation has to be conserved in those phenomena. And they're happening all the time from the point of view of physics. Inside our body, there's trillions of these virtual reactions carry on coming, and they can be intercepted. I mean, you can have a gamma ray break into a particle and antiparticle, and you can intercept them before they come back together again. And that's how they detect it on photographic plates or cloud chambers. But everything to say is right. One thing, I don't think this notion of the Big Bang, I mean, I'm not sure whether I subscribe to the Big Bang model, but that's a far-fetched, because if there was something in the universe, then we'd have a real problem explaining how it got here. So the simplest thing to assume is there's nothing here.
You mean that we are in a vacuum fluctuation?
Well, no, just that there's nothing here. I mean, that there was nothing before the Big Bang and there's nothing else.
This sounds like Buddhism.
Fluctuation includes everything, good and evil, male, female, the whole thing added together is a zero, just like it always was.
Well, then what are the complex appearances that impinge upon our senses, and what are we then?
Because we choose to pay attention to only half of the situation, but if we will let ourselves be and experience the whole, then it's all unified.
It cancels. Well, this refers back to something you and I were talking about at dinner. We all assume that there is one past and one future, but it's not clear why we assume that. I mean, think about it for a moment. We're all here gathered in this room sharing this moment, but we all have different pasts. Not one of us has the past of another. And so what we have in this room is a convergence of pasts, and when this meeting is over, we will go our separate ways into a variety of futures. So the assumption that there is one past and one future is just some kind of convenient mental bookkeeping. We are tremendously under the spell of this illusion. I mean, we worry about the future all the time. Well, notice that you could just move to an island somewhere and get a brown-skinned girl, and then you wouldn't have to worry about anybody else's future because you would have made your own future. We can step out of the assumption of a universal history in which we're trapped. And I think realizing this is the beginning of a kind of liberation. Our assumptions are the edges of our worlds, and this is one of our strongest assumptions, the assumptions that there is a past and a future, and our destinies are all caught up in that. But actually, you can, a word that rarely passes my lips, you can deconstruct that assumption, and then you're given back a whole different way of looking at the experience of being, which is empowering. Because somehow, when we are embedded in the future, we feel we have no control whatsoever. We're like corks in a raging river. But in fact, that's a false model, I think. Anybody want to get in on this? And yeah.
Sometimes when I'm listening to you, I have sort of the troubling thought that I think Terence hasn't done enough psychedelics. Or I think that you're too vague in some way, and that when you get onto some of your scientific tracks, and as you put it, you're a rationalist, I start thinking, why get lost? I start thinking, I start referring to experiences I have had of being altered, where a lot of this seems incidental to the experience, say, of one experience of eternity, or which I know you've had. And how do you reckon with yourself sometimes? I think when you say doubt yourself and think this is just my ego concocting things to make me feel good, and et cetera, whatever would be the worst case scenario for you. It's hard for me to express this sort of well, but there's something about when you're in the way that you often refer to a sort of what seems to be a scientific model that is very linear, even as you talk,
Well, I would certainly agree that I haven't taken enough psychedelics. Reading these people, it seems like, I doubt these guys are real psychedelic heads, and they're much further out than I am. The real truth is, and I've said it many times, that the world is not only stranger than we suppose, it's stranger than we can suppose. And in a way, that's either permission to suppose anything you want, or to just stop supposing, These things are models. Nowhere is it writ large that bipedal apes should be able to understand how the universe works. Still less likely is it written anywhere that Terence McKenna should be able to understand how the universe works. Were you here the other night when we talked about the black hole theory of enlightenment? It was 2 nights ago. Yeah. Well, that's the idea that the real truth can't be told. I'm very aware that all of this is just stuff to support me, to make a living, in other words. That in fact what's really going on defies rational apprehension. I hope. I would hate to think that we could understand what's going on. Nevertheless, there's something to be said for this modeling process. And I agree, I think I'm getting old. you can only push yourself so far. I mean, when I read one of these things today, and he was off on some tear, and I just realized, it struck fear in my heart. And I said, my God, and I actually did a mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the weirdest one of all? And it said, Hans Moravec is the weirdest one of all. I said, shit, what am I, I should bring him here and sit at his feet. I don't know, am I talking about what you're talking about? Oh, good.
I mean, I find it a fantastic parallel between the psychedelic experience and visits. I mean, I haven't found anything in the psychedelic experience that would be any problems to relate to kind of point of view of physicists. And actually, I think that all this stuff in physics got out of the bag because of the psychedelic, breakthroughs in the 60s. And the Fritjof Capranovas had psychedelic experiences and then started to ferret it out from, in 1920s, people were puzzling about these things and having the spiritual crises and throwing away all of their assumptions about reality and having these types of breakthroughs, and they got lost because we started to bag physics to use for the military. And it was only with an environment that opened up to psychedelics instead of coming out.
But I don't think that the purpose of science is to understand reality. This may go to what you're saying. I think the purpose of science is to advance technology, which is a heresy. I don't think reality can be understood, and that it's absolute hubris for science to, cloak itself in the mantle of philosophy. All it's for is to make better toys, or if you're nuts, better weapons. And ultimately, there's not going to be any closure in the effort to understand. And I think that the thing that you take away from psychedelics finally is that all models are provisional, that there is no truth. We talked at one point in here about Wittgenstein's phrase, true enough. True enough. True enough to get you to the gas station, true enough to get your taxes paid. But there'll be no closure on this stuff. We have to live in the light of the mystery. But I think we also said in here, it's the death of conversation if we glorify the mystery too much, because then, I'll be just like everybody else here, and I'll announce that we're now going to have a meditation, which I've never done to you, I want to point out. Somebody wanted to say
that in mind. I wonder how you can project an end to eternity at a certain time.
Well, I didn't mean to imply a nothingness beyond. It isn't like that. I think it's an everythingness. That when I talk about what I envision it as boundary dissolution, if all boundaries dissolve, then, I am you and you are me and we are all together. It's a exfoliation of the human experience. The great boundaries are, the small boundaries are man, woman, self, world, and then the big boundaries are life, death, past, future. All of these will be dissolved into something like William Blake's divine imagination, and we will become our grandest dreams. And so the whole challenge is to dream a dream worthy of that dimension. It's a very interesting exercise. I don't know if you've ever done it. God, it comes close to being a visualization, I'm sorry to notice. But have you ever played the game, what would I do if I could do anything? First of all, you have to wrap your mind around the concept, anything. what would I do if I could do anything? And I used to think about it in terms, for some reason, for me, it takes the form of an architectural fantasy. You know, first of all, I just locate myself in the house featured in last month's Architectural Digest. Then from there, I would begin to work it out. Well, if you could do anything, within a few minutes of entering into that exercise, you're unrecognizable to yourself. I mean, you don't even have to exist in a forward-flowing casuistry of 3 dimensions. You can be a number of species, all possible sexes. You can be translocated at many points in time. You begin to realize that you are tremendously limited by your assumptions, and that and this is sort of what I imagine death is. It's release into the divine imagination, and if you're, you know, blown up in an airliner or something, then immediately after dying, you're just a dead person. But then you begin to unfold and test the boundaries. And, you know, as James Joyce says in Finnegan's Wake, up in the end, prospector, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. And that's just in the first 30 seconds that you woof your wings. And then you are able to assume, to divide your consciousness, to assume any form, to be any place, to know anything. Anything recognizable as human, I think, would quickly drop away, or would just become a tiny and familiar touchstone that you would occasionally return to touch. And somehow the dying, which occurs to each one of us, that's the microcosm of the planetary and historical process that we're caught up in. It's the thing that we hate most of all. We fear it. We really get agitated when death is raised as an issue. James Joyce called it the Grim Reaper, a blessing in disguise. If you want to be phoenixed, come and be part. Meaning, you know, you have to die to fully exfoliate into this dimension. And sometimes I think, and I don't often say it to groups because I fear I'm misunderstood and I don't want people to go out of here depressed, but sometimes I think that what human history pushes for is the extermination of all life on the planet, for the simple reason that we'll never be free till then. That we are in some kind of hell world, and we are locked in a world of matter and energy and space and time, and that it is not, you know, my God, this sounds like, Southern Baptists, but we are living death at this moment, and that we must die in order to be born again. In other words, that somehow what we are has become trapped in a lower dimensional matrix, and our greatest delusion is to cling to this most tenaciously. Jorge Luis Borges, in one of his stories, has this idea that the species, any species, is somehow not completed in eternity until the last member of that species dies. And it is interesting that if you think about biology, 95% of all species that have ever lived on this planet are extinct. This is what happens to species, is they go extinct. And yet, you know, we're driven to pursue immortality. It pains us greatly to imagine the death of all life on this planet, and particularly the death of our individual selves or our species. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know what death is. One of the puzzling things about the DMT trance is, you know, these creatures made of light in the mind that are so different from us, but have such affection and love for us, they seem like relatives. They seem like, dare we whisper the word, they seem like ancestors. And yet, we would rather believe that they were aliens from Zeta Reticuli or elves in a parallel continuum than apply Occam's razor to the phenomenon and say, since we are the only intelligent entities that we have ever contacted in this universe, these things which we contact in our minds in the center of the DMT flash, they must be human beings of some sort. But they don't look like human beings. But they love us so much and understand this so well. Well, is it possible that the kind of human being they are is a dead human being? That we're actually breaking through into an ecology of souls. I mean, if we say that the psychedelic experience is an experience of boundary dissolution, and if we say that DMT is the strongest of all psychedelics, then may it not be that it is dissolving the most resistant of all barriers, which is the barrier between the living and the dead, and that what you actually come into is the antechambers of eternity for a brief glimpse. If you were to take that rap and properly translate it into Witoto or Moinani or something like that and go to the Amazon and query those folks, they'd say, well, of course. I mean, your own Merciliade tells you that shamanism depends on the spirit ancestors. And for all the credit we give shamanism, we've never actually come to grips with the possibility that shamans really do work with the spirit ancestors, that there really is an ecology of transmaterial human beings in a nearby continuum that can be approached by a boundary dissolving drug. And it's because, we, and certainly I, and certainly proven by this rap tonight, are obsessed with technological explanations of it and how it's going to be the flying saucers, it's going to be the time machine or the collapse of the quantum vector or something like that. But because the forward thrust of our technology is toward immortality. I mean, that's what's gnawing at the back of our minds. And yet what may actually be coming toward us, orthogonal, meaning at right angles to the historical process, is the dissolving of the barrier between the living and the dead, which is so unsettling and mind-boggling to us that we take a flying saucer invasion any day over having that happen to us. And yet it's very, very late in the game. Human nature is going to have to undergo a radical, vertical translation of some sort if we are to avoid the extinction of ourselves and all life on the planet. Well, so then, maybe that's what it was for. If we believe that we were always embedded in the machinery of nature, that we could never act outside the purposes of nature, then this must be what it's for. It's very interesting in embryology. I think most people think, of a fetus in the womb. As you all know, we begin as very fish-like creatures in the womb, and then out of what are essentially little paddle mitts, the human hand appears. And I think most people think that the tissue retracts tightly and that the human being emerges. But if you've seen fetal stages in models in medical schools, what's actually going on is that cells die off. A massive amount of dying goes on in the womb in order that the human form may emerge out of the fetal form. The webbing between the fingers doesn't retract. those cells die and are released into the amniotic fluid. The growth of the fetus involves the death of millions and millions and millions of cells. So we are born. We are, you could almost say, sculpted into life by the hand of death. I feel as nervous about all this as you must. But, this is what we're here for, right? To stretch the envelope. Yeah.
Terence, I would like to go back to something that you said about the beings of light and the shamanic capacity to see and to interact with these beings, and they could be the ancestors. Thinking in terms of those individuals who refined their senses to being able to see more than the average ability to see, and to be able to hear more than just the normal ability to hear, where there's a growing awareness of almost like interpenetrating plans of beings that are actually coexisting with us, but we just can't hear them or see them because we haven't refined those senses enough. And the more psychically sensitive individuals have an increasing ability in a non-drug state to be aware. It's just they could see more and hear more. And I hadn't heard you say that.
Well, yeah. That's a very good point. The perfect example of it in terms of a cultural tradition is fairyland. Fairyland is the pre-Christian Celtic peoples believed that dead souls stayed around in the immediate vicinity, and that there were thousands of them all around, the accumulated dead, very much in the way that when you smoke DMT, then there are thousands of these things, and it raises the question, were they always there, or what's going on? St. Patrick, who brought Christianity to Ireland, found this belief. And also, Anita makes the point about sensitivity. In Irish folklore, there's the idea that if you have the eye, you can see these things, and no drugs are required. It's a psychic ability, which the country Celtic people have sometimes claimed. So when Patrick came to Ireland on his mission of conversion, he found this belief in fairyland so powerfully entrenched in these people that he invented purgatory. Purgatory was invented by St. Patrick to convert the Irish. And then when word was carried back to Rome that Patrick, who was this great bishop of the early church, that he had made this doctrinal concession to Celtic folk thinking, the Pope thought it was such a fine idea that they just wrote it into dogma. So purgatory, which as you all know is neither heaven nor hell, but a place where you expiate your sins for some amount of time before you pass on to heaven, is nothing less than a cleaned up version of fairyland written into Christian theology. Now, I don't know why the Celtic people would have not a monopoly, but a firm grip on this. It may be their innate gloominess, their obsession with death, their, it's called the agenbite of Inuit. It's that we just chew on ourselves till we dissolve, but there was something about that character that set it up for perceiving these entities, although in all traditions all over the world, if you dig deep enough, you can usually find a tradition of small people that live in the hills or under the hills, meaning graves, right, under the hills, and they are the ancestors. And the best that straight folklorists can tell is they have some weird law that as the people recedes into time, they shrink, which seems to me preposterous. I just don't understand that. I think that the evidence is pretty good that this is going on. the fact that DMT is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter is very suggestive. Rupert Sheldrake has made the suggestion that dying is a unique chemical experience, and he calls DMT a necrotic hallucinogen, that you actually, if you are truly dying, your brain will be flooded with DMT, and then you will see the ecology of souls waiting to receive you. I once questioned a very well-known Tibetan teacher about what was going on in DMT, and he said, yes, these are the lesser lights. He said, you can't, if you go further than that, you will break the thread of connection and be unable to return. And so, I think this is the most challenging idea to us on the conscious and unconscious level, because we may, I'm only speaking for myself, but it seems to me true that we really have, at a profound level, accepted the scientific lie that death is non-entity, and it gives us, it's a permanently weakening idea, because it makes us each such a finite being. It means that no matter what you do, eventually, it will all end in the cold, cold ground. Always at my back I hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. This coyness, lady, would be no crime, had we but world enough and time. The grave's a lovely private place, but none do there, I think, embrace. Well, maybe Andrew Marvell was wrong. Maybe there's more fun on the other side than you might wish to be congealed. Anybody, save me from myself.
I'm wondering, I have the impression what comes to mind is a world that you project where everybody is schizophrenic, so that today I can be Napoleon, tomorrow Jesus, and I can meet somebody else who also believes that he is Napoleon, Jesus, Buddha, or whatever, and back and forth in kind. I'm just wondering what kind of a place that's going to be.
Well, I would buy into that. I think schizophrenia is the absence of cultural expectation. In the most profound sense. The casuistry doesn't even apply. I consider myself schizophrenic, and I have observed schizophrenia in other members of my family at close-up in great detail. And what it is it's simply the breakdown of casuistry, and then ordinary people imprisoned in the hallucination of culture, language, and linear time lock you up and put you away because you're reporting from outside the cultural envelope and carrying information that terrifies, alarms, disturbs, and just you drive other people crazy is what it is. I'm talking now about process schizophrenia, which is the spectacular kind where you bring back information that is absolutely incommiserate with the models of your culture. No, I think it's been said that the world is becoming more schizophrenic. Well, that's just because they didn't have the word psychedelic. A psychedelic experience is essentially a kind of schizophrenia, and the people who in the early phase of psychedelic research, they wanted to call it a psychotomimetic, meaning it mimics psychosis. It doesn't mimic psychosis, it's a schizomimetic or some sort. Psychosis is a whole different pathology, but schizophrenia is simply a category for behavior and insight that the rest of society is unable to do anything with, I think. Yeah, no, that doesn't trouble me at all. I like talking about I'm schizophrenic. Maybe this answers your criticism that I'm linear and running down and old. I can always go nuts. You know, if all else fails, you can go bananas, I suppose. The schizophrenics return with the great aesthetic visions and the scientific breakthroughs and the poetic understandings. I mean, and it's almost as though they have been aided by the demon artificers. They have taken into their retinue supernatural helpers. And a shaman would say, of course, allies. And I'm sure you all know the way in which schizophrenia and shamanism map together. I mean, our own Julian Silverman is the great pioneer in the one-to-one mapping of shamanism and schizophrenia. And years ago, when I was completely bananas, every time they would approach from three sides with nets, I had Julian's paper called Shamanism and Schizophrenia, and I could quote it chapter and verse and back them off because what is called the initiatory crisis in shamanism is nothing more than a schizophrenic break with ordinary reality. The problem is we freak out completely and rush to drug people and give them electroshock and tie them down and slap them around. Well, so then the unfolding of the process is interrupted, and it's as though you were to, you know, perform surgery on a fetus or something and then be amazed when it turns out a monstrosity. When if you would just have left it alone, for crying out loud, it was unfolding along its own creodes of morphological development. This is why people like R.D. Laing seem to me to be the ones who thought most deeply and correctly about schizophrenia. To become schizophrenic is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. The trick is to make sure that you're nowhere where straight people can get at you. And my schizophrenic episode occurred in the Amazon basin, and you know, it was 5 days march to just a mission. And I've always felt that evading modern mental health care facilities saved my mind. Absolutely. And in a traditional society, it's supported. You know, if someone shows signs because they're dreamy or they hallucinate or they're epileptic or something like that, then this is encouraged and they're put under the care of shamans, and drugs are used to initiate the crisis in some cases. And it's a cause for great rejoicing to have these personalities because in the culture, because they're the antennas for the culture that are contacting the raw stuff of real being and transducing it down into cultural artifacts and institutions that then are useful. Anything else?
We're in for the paradox.
Oh yeah, what did you want to say?
Your idea of the endpoint made perfect sense to me. I did the grandfather paradox to some injection. It's the theory of...
No, I don't think it's a paradox.
It's a self-consistent universe. You're here, so you didn't kill you. If you killed your grandfather, it would be here to ask the question.
I think that's the way to handle that. I think when we finally really understand time travel, we may find out that it's common as dirt and has been going on all around us in all kinds of physical processes.
Story. The human mind likes to make up stories, so if he came back and killed your grandfather and you still hated him, we'd have to make up a story. Like somebody else got into your grandmother. So
But since that isn't how it works.
I mean, people disappear mysteriously, and all sorts of things happen, and we just fit them into a framework that makes sense to us. And when we're in a realm of time travel, then maybe we'll have to reinterpret all that weird stuff that occurred in history.
That's an excellent point, that all kinds of stuff goes on around us that may be, in fact, the collapse of paradoxical situations that we don't understand, like, you know, all these well-documented cases of spontaneous human combustion and stuff like that. I mean, unless you just flat out deny that this goes on, which is a kind of cop-out, I think, because it just means you don't believe large bodies of evidence. I mean, not everything weird that's claimed goes on. But on the other hand, I don't think God is a Republican. I think there's plenty of weird shit flying around. And as I said, nowhere is it writ that anthropoid apes should understand reality. And every culture that's ever existed has operated under the illusion that it understood 95% of reality and that the other 5% would be delivered in the next 18 months. And from Egypt forward, they've been running around believing they had a perfect grip on things. And yet we look back at every society that preceded us with great smugness at how naive they all were. Well, it never occurs to us then that maybe we're whistling in the dark too, that the universe is stranger than you can suppose, and that openness, that perception imparts is a great joy, a great blessing, because then you can live your life not in service to some fascistic metaphor, but in service to the living mystery, the fact that you're not going to understand it. It is not going to yield to logic or magic or any other technique that's developed. It's bigger. You know, the novelist John Crowley has this wonderful aphorism: the further in you go, the bigger it gets. And I think this is true of most things. That's all, folks.